What will become valuable is the ability to think new things, is the ability to be creative. And it is that skill or that ability that we need to teach our kids. The ability to think, the ability to reason, the ability to be creative, to make non-linear connections between different things and so on, right? Fundamentally, the bar, while on the one hand, yes, students' attention spans are going down, but the bar for someone like me to create a great curriculum, or someone who's teaching in a school, or someone who's designing a learning product, that has gone up, which is a good thing overall, right? Because now you have to compete against all these distractions. So you have to create something that the student genuinely cares about and loves. The human mind will find its engagement, will find its nourishment or interest or excitement somewhere. Now, you have to ensure, as system designers, as platform designers, as curriculum designers, as teachers, to make sure where they are finding their engagement in is constructive. You cannot blame a child getting distracted. It's not the child's fault. It's how the human mind works. So I think this whole cost of acquisition versus LTV, that equation is skewed for almost every player in the so-called edtech space. That's one of the reasons why we see all the chaos that's happening right now. I believe that the closer you stay to this end, which is aristocratic tutoring, which is a tutor working with your child one-to-one as much as possible, I think that has a lot of impact. You can't deploy capital to solve that problem. It requires thoughtfulness, it requires research, it requires working in theory and so on. So in the case of learning, it requires you to see certain cycles of the student going through a learning process and seeing what's working, what's not. So the first question I ask every entrepreneur who comes to me and says, advise me on building my startup, I tell them, are you in it for 2 decades? Because if you're not, then you shouldn't do it. A lot of education is driven by word of mouth. You may have great reviews or great ads, but ultimately when it comes to making a decision about your child, you'll ask some of your good friends and colleagues on what to do, right? In education and healthcare, again, these are not commodity or transactional businesses, right? These are businesses of trust. And funnily, the way a consumer might interpret a higher price is higher quality. It's easier to retain an education consumer than it is to acquire a new consumer. So focus heavily on retaining your consumers. If they're not sticking with you, then you don't have a business to build.
Hi. This is Siddharth Aluwalia. Welcome to 100x Entrepreneur Podcast. Today I have with me Manan Khurma, founder of Cuemath. Cuemath is today's one of India's largest, and I think is going to be one of the world's largest in the next few years, the maths platform for K-12 and then going beyond for professional maths education as well. Manan has been an entrepreneur who has seen various highs and lows in his entrepreneurial journey. So Manan founded an offline venture for maths tutoring right from his college in 2006 while studying in IIT Delhi. And he ran that venture till 2013. It was an IIT JEE test prep for maths. And then he exited that venture and he saw that, right, he can't improve the fundamentals at IIT JEE level of kids at kindergarten, and during the K-12 it's broken. So this time when he started Cuemath, he wanted to really improve that. But today in our podcast, Manan, we are going to discuss also about the edtech landscape in India.
Yeah, sure.
So edtech has seen various highs and lows. I think edtech is itself an entrepreneur, if you want to call it, right?
Yeah.
Nobody noticed edtech for a long period of time.
Yeah.
And then, EduComp happened somewhere in 2009, 2010, and people started noticing edtech. And then when EduComp failed, people dismissed edtech again, that you can't build an edtech in India. Let's go back to the coaching classes for test prep, right? The Bansals, the FitGs of the world.
Yeah.
And then when, Byju's and Unacademies of the world started scaling. And then when COVID happened, right, edtech again became the poster child of growth. And, VCs wanted to have few bets in edtech. Every VC wanted to have bet in edtech.
Yeah.
And now, once we are now seeing massive layoff across the edtech sector, because everybody agrees that the boom during the COVID, where kids were getting taught only online, was kind of like artificial. Those 2 years don't really represent the real world right now. EdTech has again become, not a favorite of either consumers, people who want to work in EdTech, or of VCs. So Manan, let's discuss, what's your view of the EdTech landscape in India, both online and offline?
I think firstly, Siddharth, EdTech itself is kind of it represents an inaccurate picture in the sense that ed and tech, it portrays that it's a combination of two things, education and technology. But the reality is that it's all about education. Education is at the heart of what for example, we are trying to do with Cuemath. Tech is an enabler. Tech is a means to an end, but ultimately the end is education. The end is learning outcomes for the child. So unless and until you start from that starting point, which is that the goal of an education business is end outcomes and technology is an enabler to it, you'll always form an inaccurate picture in your mind of what education startups or education organizations are all about. So at Cuemath, for example, we don't even think of ourselves as an edtech company. We think of ourselves as an education company first and foremost, and even more specifically a math learning company, right? We don't even call ourselves edtech, if you go internally and ask people within our company. So I think that's the starting kind of background context, right? Tech is an enabler, but the goal is education or learning outcomes, right? And if a startup does not focus on that first and foremost, if a education organization that does not focus on creating those outcomes, they are bound to fail in the long run. And we have seen so many of these examples. You mentioned Educom. There have been many, many other examples I've seen over the last 15 years of my experience in this space. I started teaching right out of college, even before that. So I have spent more than 15 years as a teacher, as an educator, as someone who's been an education entrepreneur. It's all about learning. It's all about outcomes. It's all about ultimately having an impact on the child, on your learner. Tech is a great enabler to do that, but tech is not the end goal. What I'm seeing right now as chaos in the edtech space was bound to happen, given that so many people focused on the wrong things. There was a lot of FOMO created during the COVID, phase of those 2 years when everyone wanted to get into edtech because edtech startups were growing and so on. But we have, stayed away from that noise, relatively speaking, because I've seen these cycles in the past also. I've seen how there was FOMO around EduComp at one point, for example. It was one of the fastest growing companies on the publicly listed markets in India. But then it tanked because many reasons, but one of them was that ultimately schools did not see value in the product that they were offering, and there was no stickiness of it, right? So the same thing is happening now in the current chaos of edtech. That said, learning is never going to stop. As long as the human race will exist, children and learners will need to learn, will need to grow and so on. So there'll always be demand, and which will continue to grow, by the way, given how the world is changing, how AI is rising and so on. The demand for good learning for kids will continue to increase and rise in various shapes and forms. So the demand for great education will always stay. And those within the education system who take a long-term view of this, our goal is not to build a startup or a business. Our goal is to build an institution that will, over the long run, create great outcomes for the child. They are going to thrive. So when I think of our own example, I think the way we've been approaching building a math learning platform, math learning ecosystem, we are continuing to see great demand from all over the place, and we're continuing to grow and so on. So I think this chaos in edtech, which we see right now, is an outcome of people focusing on the wrong things. But this noise will settle. It will settle over the next few months or maybe a year or so. And then a new crop of education players, and I'm consciously not using edtech, I'm using education because education is the goal, as I said. A new crop of education players will emerge who will go on to do really well.
And which are the education companies that inspire you, like who you take inspiration from to build a product like them or a company like them?
Again, I would say there are many. I wouldn't say education companies. I would again go back to the word institution. So there are many institutions that inspire me. All the great colleges of the world, for example, are education organizations that I look up to. My own college, IIT, for example, Harvard, MIT. These are institutions that have built their reputation and credibility over decades and centuries. That's how institutions get built. You create quality, you create trust, and so on. I think within the more contemporary examples, I love what Sal Khan has done with Khan Academy. The way he's been able to take whatever he's built to millions of learners across the world. Many of them have really benefited from it. I think that's been a very inspiring example. I do follow a lot of education researchers and a lot of math learning researchers in particular. There's this person called Paul Lockhart that I really like in terms of his thoughts on math thinking and so on. And there are companies across the world who are doing good work in their own ways. But yeah, I think a lot of the current so-called edtech companies are not inspiring for obvious reasons, because many of them not focused on the primary goal of creating outcomes, was focused on something else, and that this chaos was bound to happen at some point.
So there hasn't been any institution, because whatever institutions you talked about, the first reason why they are great is because they took only the great set of students.
Yeah. I mean, that's
the selection criteria
that's
was
an argument,
so
valid
skewed,
argument, yes.
Right. But there was nobody, right? And Khan Academy grew as a non-profit. But for profit, any institution which is capable of serving million students a year, is there anyone?
There's one company that comes to mind which has been around for a few decades. It's called Kumon, Kumon. It has some presence in India as well, but it primarily started as a Japanese company for math and English and then scaled to the US. In the US, it has a fairly big presence at this point. It has, I think, more than 500,000 students. It has $1 billion of revenue per year. So that's one example of an after-school learning company that I know of that has scaled really well.
Hi everyone. Before we begin, I would like to share that this podcast is brought to you by Prime Venture Partners, an early stage VC fund led by Amir Somani, Shripati Acharya, and Sanjay Swami. Prime is often the first institutional investor in category defining tech startups in fintech, SaaS, healthcare, and education, such as MyGate, Quizzes, Planet Spark, Bolt, and Clip. To know more about Prime, visit primevp.in.
Apart from that, you do have, for example, publishing platforms like McGraw-Hill, Pearson, that have over the decades grown into massive businesses. But you're right. In the private space, we have not seen too many examples of, companies having evolved into long-term institutions in the private space. But I think over this coming decade, next couple of decades, you are bound to see that happen as well, because I think the way the world is moving, right, the way technology is evolving and so on, a lot of the traditional models of learning will get disrupted. Schooling, for example, right, schooling has been the same for the last 2 centuries, maybe since the Industrial Revolution till today. It's the exact same model of schooling that still continues. Teacher stands on the blackboard, starts kind of broadcasting to the entire group. All kids are listening to the same thing. Most of them are switched off and so on. In today's age, there's no way that model will continue beyond a few years or a couple of decades from now. It's bound to be disrupted in some way. So we will see a lot of new formats, a lot of new kinds of platforms emerging, and I do think some of them will end up turning into big institutions.
Though I think, it takes decades to build an institution which, could stand like IITs or Harvard. But there is one phenomenal behavior change which has happened in last decade, I think, which is going to continue. It is the attention span of the kids.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Right? The last decade has really brought down the attention span of the kid because of digital devices, tablets, mobiles, the time kids are spending on top of it. Today kids, even my kid, right, it's very hard to make him eat food without a cartoon on the mobile.
Yeah, I'm seeing the same with my son. He's about to turn 2. And we try to keep him completely away from screens and TV and so on. But I'm starting to see that behavior set in a little bit, but go on.
Yeah, and this behavior has come in like really early, and what scientists say that it turns off a part of the creative part of the brain for the kid, and reduction in attention span. So you can't expect the same education system to foster to at least this set of kids whose first set of interactions with the outside world is mobile, outside their parents.
Yeah, I mean, completely agree, by the way. And this has been one thing I've been really, talking about with a lot of people. So the attention span of humanity as a whole is going down, is fragmenting, right? And information overload will only continue to increase. It's not going down. So I think expecting that status quo will continue on how we train our young ones, how we train our learners, that's not going to happen. You have to make peace, first of all, with the fact that, attention spans are going down, and children are not to blame. Like adults, all of us, for example, our own attention spans are going down and so on, right? No one is ready to, or like hardly people would think twice before clicking even on a 5-minute video today, right? They're more used to shorts and, like 30-seconders and so on.
If you ask both of us, right, are we ready to trade our smartphone for a old Nokia phone for a kid? We are not.
It's unthinkable. So I think given that is happening and will continue to increase, how do we, in this era, with this information overload all around us, how do we train our young children today? Right? That's going to be one of the defining questions of this century, right? If we don't navigate through it properly, we are like a lot of our children are going to just end up as not realizing their full potential, right? So I think a lot of things need to happen. First, we have to move away from this traditional one-size-fit-all approach, where like this one teacher is working with 40 students at a time and so on. I think we are entering an era of hyper-personalization and hyper-customization where your target audience is a set of one. You have to optimize for a single kid. What that single kid likes, what their interests are, what their current proficiency levels are in different things, and so on. You have to be able to build systems that personalize and adapt and customize to a student at that level rather than a cohort of students.
I disagree with that.
Okay, yeah. You tell me what's the disagreement.
The reason is that placing kids under a group of 40, right? Though more than 40, it can become chaotic. But let's say 30 or 40 kids helps them teach social skills at the same time, right?
Yeah.
And human race has always been competitive, right? If you study the book Sapiens, right? How we evolved is the most competitive humans wins. Food and reproduction were the only things, right? Our cells were trained for from the beginning.
Yeah.
So the one who is most able to adapt, the one who is most competitive wins.
Yeah, absolutely. See, I think, and again, the nuance here that I like to draw out is when you are acquiring new learning, or when you are struggling with something, or when you are being exposed to something new, the way you respond to a certain kind of information or to a certain kind of instruction may be different from the way I respond to it, right? So there are certain parts of the learning or growth journey that need to be done delinked from each other, right? So for example, if you and I are put today in the same calculus class or the same relativity class, and a teacher comes and starts broadcasting, you may pick up that material far faster than I will, right? So that needs to be accounted for. But that said, one of my theses, for example, is that in this century, one of the skills that will become really important is the ability to collaborate with each other, the ability to collaborate and solve complex problems, right? The future of work is all going to be about, I mean, the era of lone geniuses may not be there anymore. And, when AI is taking over so much and so on, and you might have far more collaboration between, people talented in different ways and people working with each other to unlock complex problems. That also needs to be taught. What I'm saying is that the model that is followed in most education systems today, which is a group of kids get the same instruction at the same rate on the same thing, that is broken. That needs to be changed for, right? Kids need to be delinked from each other in certain aspects. For example, when it comes to new learning or when it comes to passing through a struggling phase, they need to be given the time and space to think on their own. If you like cricket, for example, and I like soccer, maybe you should get math problems in the context of cricket and I should get them in the context of soccer. Our attention, our engagement will be far higher in that case. There are certain areas of learning where personalization, collaboration, personalization and adaptivity needs to happen. And there are certain areas where collaboration needs to be taught. So the whole growth stack, as I call it, which is the way a human goes from age 0 to age 20, which is the most formative 20 years of your life. And you go through, early learning, you go through parenting, you go through, school, you go through after school classes. That entire stack of services, organizations, curricula, and so on. That entire growth stack needs to be rethought in the context of this thing that you pointed out, which is everyone's attention spans are going down. So what do you do now? So yeah, I think a lot of things need to be fundamentally rethought.
I think social is one area where a kid interacts with other kids, right? That can only help retain that kind of an attention span which you and I were when we were growing up. Right, that we could witness, right, that we could develop social skills and competitive skills, and that's how even the IIT-JEE model is structured. Right, only few kids who are great at PCM, physics, chemistry, and maths get into IIT. And even if those kids don't study at all for 4 or 5 years, they come out great. Seeing their peers.
See, I think one of my beliefs is, and again coming back to this point that you mentioned of certain kids already being great and hence doing better and so on. I think everyone starts out great. If you take, let's say, 10 kids, all of age 5 or age 4, and if you look at their ability to think or be curious or be creative, all of them will be great in certain ways, right? The divergence starts to happen as they pass through the traditional growth stack, as I call it, right, which is schooling and after schooling and so on. The way the entire system is set up optimizes for the wrong metrics, optimizes for the wrong kind of behavior, right? For example,
but you can't change the system.
No, you can. It will get changed. Someone will change it. Or
the government curriculum.
You look at what ChatGPT has done in the last 2 weeks, right? Everyone's raving about it. Everyone's saying, okay, now my assignments will be written on their own and so on. And professors are saying, okay, what do we do now? And these non-linear unlocks, let's say in terms of AI or in terms of other technologies, will only continue to compound exponentially. So there's no way the status quo will hold beyond a certain point. There's just too much pent-up anti-pressure that's built now.
Can you share how status quo in education has evolved over a period of time?
I think it's not evolved. That's the problem. I think
last 40 years, if you take it, right?
I think for a child, if you look at it from a child's perspective, one of the most influential interventions in their life is schooling. right? They spend the best part of their day in a school, but walk into any school today, it's exactly the same as it was 100 years before. What's changed? Nothing's changed. I mean, some superficial technology might have been brought in. Class sizes, I think, have only increased, not decreased. You have, maybe in a few good schools, you have 1:20 or 1:15, or even 1:10 in exceptional cases. But in most cases, it's 1:30, 1:40, and so on. For real learning to happen in that kind of a setting is simply not possible. Yes, you do pick up other skills, like you pick up social skills and so on. You form friendships, and I think that part is also important. But learning is not happening. Learning won't happen in this kind of a setting, and that's why you see so many kids getting turned off from their academics, from their schooling, from their subjects, and so on. So I think part of the reason why we need to exist as an education organization doing math learning is because it's not happening in the status quo system here. Kids are not learning math well. It's a well-documented, well-researched phenomenon across the world. Everyone knows this. Everyone knows that math learning across the world is broken. And in the context of today's, rise of technology, math fluency is only going to become more and more important. If you're okay letting a kid not being math fluent, that's going to severely constrain the kid's future opportunities and, career paths and so on. So every child deserves a great foundation in math, for example, but the status quo cannot ensure that, and that's why we as a player need to exist.
Dear listeners, if you have been following our podcast, you would have been hearing about Zoho Payroll. Zoho Payroll's mission is to democratize payroll technology for everyone. Hence, they have made a free version of Zoho Payroll for startups and businesses who have up to 10 employees. It has all the features to automate payroll compliance, salary calculations, payments, and much more to pay salaries on time. You can use it for free forever, no questions asked. Even as a startup, give your employees a great payroll experience right from the start. Check out the link in the description to know more about Zoho Payroll. Thank you.
I think another massive behavior change besides attention span is 10 years ago, if you remember, right, you and I studied from physical books, or 15 years ago. For cheat codes, there used to be separate set of books, right? How to this set of questions will have this set of answer. Now everything is available online.
Yeah.
Right? There's huge information. Nothing needs to be in a physical book really. Today. And as you mentioned, right, kids don't need to even Google search their answers today. They can just go on ChatGPT and type their question and it'll answer. Right. So getting answers has become really easy. So how we also evolved is it was a tougher environment as compared to what is available today to kids. And that's why in our hustle or in our effort to figure it out, to give 10 attempts, 20 attempts to a question, if you go to the best physics books like Rajnik Halliday, something like that.
Irodov and all those books.
Irodov of that time, which were the gold mines for IIT. Those efforts the brain is not getting that kind of muscle developing effort. Right, not that kind of a gym. So I think that's another problem.
You're spot on. So I think you put it very well. Getting answers has become really easy and will continue to become easier and easier, right? To the extent that you just put in your assignment statement, and it might be a complex coding assignment, and you might just put it into something like ChatGPT, and it will generate all the code, and you don't even need to spend a single moment thinking, right? So this kind of getting answers, that skill, that thing is going to become super easy, right? So there's no longer value in getting answers, and that's, by the way, one of the reasons why I think the traditional status quo is going to get disrupted. There's no point anymore in teaching students facts or helping them memorize things that can instantly be looked up on Google, for example. What will become valuable is the ability to think new things, is the ability to be creative, and it is that skill or that ability that we need to teach our kids. The ability to think, the ability to reason, the ability to be creative, to make non-linear connections between different things and so on, right? So in Cuemath's context, for example, one of the things we tell our teachers is that your job as a teacher is not to be an explainer of concepts, but to be a questioner. You need to question rather than explain. So, for example, if we're talking about this, let's say, mic here, right? And I ask you, okay, this mic, what is the shape of this mic? In a traditional class, I might go off into a rant and say, this is a cylinder, it has a curved surface, two flat surfaces, this is how you find the surface area of it, and so on. In a Cuemath class, I will make you think. I will question you. I'll say, okay, what is this? And you'll say something. I'll say, okay, how many surfaces do you see? You might say, okay, curved surface. And then I say, okay, do you see any other surface? So there's a back and forth dialogue that happens between the teacher and the student to get the student to think, to get the student to come up with the answer rather than the teacher telling the answer, right? So I think that ability for the system, the teacher, the book, whatever tool that's being used to get the student to think is going to be the most important aspect of any education platform or system. And that's one of the reasons why I think schooling in its status quo form is going to get disrupted, because it doesn't make the student think. It's all about downloading. It's all about saying, okay, go and find answers. I mean, just get answers, and what's valued is the answer rather than the process of getting to the answer. What's valued is the final outcome rather than the ability to think, reason, look at a problem from different perspectives and so on. And I think it's not so much about a physical book versus a digital, video or something else. It's about how do you get a child to think? How do you get a child to reason? How do you get a child to be creative? That's going to be valuable. And every aspiring education company needs to think about that, because the ability to find answers is no longer valuable, as we've seen. So, yeah.
Also, the other thing is that the most of the learning we thought that happens during teacher to student interaction, but it's not the case. The real learning happens once a student is putting his brains in isolation to a problem.
Absolutely.
That part is like slowly taken away.
Yeah. When I started teaching for the first time, I used to be fairly good at math. And, when I started teaching my very first set of students, I remember my mental model back then was, if you were to ask me back then, who's a great teacher, or, do you think you're a great teacher? I would have said, yes, absolutely. I'm a master of the subject and I'm so fluent at it. And, I'm giving all this gyan to my students, and then it's up to them to imbibe it and learn from it. And that's what I thought who a good teacher or a great teacher is. But over the years, I've now come to, deeply believe, and I think it's almost everyone will agree with me, a great teacher is someone who can get the student to get that same mastery replicated in their head. So there's certain mental patterns in my head around, let's say, some idea or some concept. Unless and until I get that thinking replicated in my learner's head, I failed, right? So if you're teaching me, for example, and if you are a great, let's say, master of relativity, but you're not getting me to understand, then you're not great as a teacher. So yeah, I think getting the student to independently think and arrive at the same understanding of what the teacher is trying to explain, that transference needs to happen, and that's what a great teaching process looks like.
I also believe, right, our environments have changed, right? The number of screens in our home has increased by a lot.
Yeah.
In our times when we were growing up, at least till we were studying for IITJ, there used to be only the television screen in the home, and that was the only distraction. I used to remember that, asking my grandfather or my mom to switch off the TV because it was creating noise in a small middle class home. Today there are infinite number of screens, right? It can go up to. So one rule that I have is the number of books in a home should be 50x the number of screens. You can't shape how a child is growing. You can't control that. But you can put some interference in their environment as a parent, as a caretaker.
So that's part of the solution, which is you shape the environment in a way where the ability to get distracted goes down, and where the ability to pick up good habits like reading, for example. Why is reading a good habit? Because it makes you focus and think and so on, right? But I also think that there's another part to solving this problem, and I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing, by the way, which is that information overload is growing and will only continue to grow. It used to bother me quite a lot, a few years back, but now I think I've made my peace with it. I mean, like, humanity is progressing as a whole, and this is only going to increase. So you have to make your peace with it and say, okay, what do we do in this context? I think what this will do is force, let's say, parents, schools, educators, systems to give to students things that they really care about, So fundamentally the bar, while on the one hand, yes, students' attention spans are going down, but the bar for someone like me to create a great curriculum, or someone who's teaching in a school, or someone who's designing a learning product, that has gone up, which is a good thing overall, right? Because now you have to compete against all these distractions. So you have to create something that the student genuinely cares about and loves, which means that firstly, I mean, you have to invest your heart and soul into building something like this, because it's not an easy problem to solve. But once you do it, then the student will actually choose that over other so-called distractions, right? The reason a student is choosing to play PUBG today versus reading their math book is because the math book is just not that engaging. It's not the student's fault. It's not that engaging, right? So if we were given the choice between, let's say, playing a great, Call of Duty game or, reading some abstract book, what would we choose? We can't force our students to also, our children to say, okay, no, but you cannot get distracted. You have to do this. I think those days are gone, I remember this interesting trip I went to in Ladakh. I was on a solo trip and I went to this very remote monastery. And outside, I saw a bunch of, you have the Buddhist monks, lamas, right? They're kids, all in their traditional robes. They were all sitting outside. And they all were sitting kneeling on the ground, maybe some 15, 20 kids. And they had jackets pulled over their heads, right? And I could see from a distance that, okay, this group of kids are sitting and, they have jackets pulled over their heads and they're doing something. So I walked over to those kids and I asked one of them, oh, what are you doing? And then he takes off his jacket and he has a mobile phone in his hand. And the entire group of 20 Lama kids in the remotest part of Ladakh, they are playing PUBG. So that's like an incredible moment for me. Like, okay, the human mind will find its engagement, will find its nourishment or interest or excitement somewhere. Now, you have to ensure as system designers, as platform designers, as curriculum designers, as teachers, to make sure where they are finding their engagement in is constructive. You cannot blame a child getting distracted. It's not the child's fault. It's how the human mind works. You have to design for it is the point I'm trying to make. But yes, what you suggested is a good first step, which is to shape the environment correctly. And I also do that at my home. I have lots of books. And my son, even though he's just 2 years, he started picking those books out because he sees me read a lot. So he pulls out those books and brings them to me. Sometimes he opens them up and so I think he might get shaped as someone who likes reading, given the influence of the environment.
Coming back to, building education venture as an entrepreneur, you have certain thesis on how not to build an education venture.
Oh, yeah.
Would love to know your thoughts on that.
There are lots of aspects to it. So let me talk about the learning or pedagogy aspects of it, right? I think firstly, I've always believed that in terms of the impact you can have on a learner or a student, having a teacher present, having a human present as part of the delivery mechanism really matters. So there's this very interesting article someone wrote a few months back on why is the world not producing geniuses anymore. So something like that, right? So this guy basically makes the point that in ancient or medieval times, you had all kinds of, big thinkers, scientists and artists and so on, right? Why is it not happening now? Or is it happening or is it not happening? Maybe he's trying to question. So one of the points he made was that back then you used to have a lot of what he called aristocratic tutoring, which essentially means you have a kid who's a king's son or daughter or whatever, and the king says, okay, let me get the best scientist in the land and teach my kid, right? So the best scientist would follow, or the best philosopher would follow this kid all day and teach him and so on, and this kid would grow up to be a great thinker, right? So this is what happened, I think, in the case of Alexander, right? So Alexander's father got him, I think, tutored by Plato, I think, or Socrates or Plato, one of these, if I remember correctly. But anyway, so you used to get these examples of, kids who were exposed to the best ideas from a very young age on a constant basis, and they ended up becoming great thinkers or great leaders and so on. That is, let's say, the extreme end of what a learning system should look like, aristocratic tutoring. On the other hand, you have very passive systems like a book. Okay, here's a book, go read it on your own and figure stuff out. And then you have all kinds of interventions in the spectrum. You have, let's say, a better form of books is videos. A better form of videos is interactive simulations and games and so on, right? Then you have like mass classes, like 1:40. Then you have small group classes. Then you have 1:1 classes and so on. So an entire spectrum. I believe that the closer you stay to this end, which is aristocratic tutoring, which is a tutor working with your child one-to-one as much as possible, which is also called, for example, high dosage tutoring in education literature, right? I think that has a lot of impact. So having a tutor, having a teacher work with your child, bringing that human element of motivation and encouragement, it really matters. And hence I've always believed that just designing a learning app or a learning product will not have an impact. Even for Khan Academy, for all the good content it has, the completion rates are not very high, because students ultimately tend to just switch off and not be motivated to complete the course and so on. So that's one thing which I always tell education entrepreneurs who come to me and say, okay, what kind of learning model should we design? I always tell them, figure out models where a human is involved to push the learner, to to complete the journey or to complete. And that's why, for example, we do a lot of one-on-one classes because it just has so much impact. I think the other thing is the whole personalization adaptivity angle. Every child is different. If there are a billion kids across the world, there are a billion different optimal paths to learn. There's no one optimal path. So how do you design a system that addresses these unique needs, interests, of students? So that's one. So these are some, ideas, principles on the learning side. And one of the things that, we believe in deeply is the right kind of scaffolding, which is, I believe every child can be taken from basic level to a level of mastery only if the path is built correctly. So one analogy I often use is climbing Mount Everest, right? The reason climbing Mount Everest is hard is not because the summit is too high. It's because the climb is too abrupt. And that's why, for example, you and I may find it very difficult to make that climb, whereas an expert mountaineer could do it. But what if you had a very gradual ramp around the mountain going all the way up to the top? Then you and I could just walk on that ramp and, just kind of get to the summit.
I think it is designed by experts in such a way that there's a base 0, base 1,
exactly,
base 2, base 3.
And if you make it even more granular, right, then everyone could kind of do that climb. The same thing applies to a learner. Like if you design a learning path in a way where it rises very gradually, then you can take any learner up to a level of mastery. So, you design for that. So these are some things that, some principles on the learning side. On the business side, again, I think I've always believed that education is about outcomes. Education is about impact. The brands that will create outcomes, create impact, they will sustain and they will thrive. They will have huge demand to the extent that they can't even service it. Back then when I was prepping for the IIT entrance exam, this is 2003, we used to have this coaching institute called Vidya Mandir classes in the NCR region. And I remember demand for that being just insane. Like everyone wanted to get in because, they were producing results year after year and so on. And that was my first kind of experience with this idea that if an education company creates results consistently, has impact consistently, then ultimately parents, students start trusting it and they start going in. Then there's exponential growth, right? But you have to wait a certain amount of time to create that trust, to get your systems right, to start creating impact and so on. And you cannot short circuit this process by putting in capital. You just have to, go build, just do the whole bamboo roots taking hold. You have to give it that time. So I've always believed in not overspending and saying, okay, let's just throw marketing dollars at, growth, but be patient and spend in the right ways. A subset of that we're seeing today is that paid marketing channels for education companies are not working out very well.
Yeah, it's like crazy. 30,000 per acquired paid customer.
Even more than that. You won't believe some of the numbers that I...
What is the real number? That would be the number.
Lakhs.
A lakh for a paid acquired. And the
Not for us, I'm saying. But yeah, I know of many cases where the cost of acquiring a customer, when you factor in all the real costs, is upward of 1 lakh. And the LTV is like 1/4 of that or like 1/3 of that, right? So these are businesses where just money is being sunk in and nothing is coming out of it. So I think this whole, cost of acquisition versus LTV, that equation is skewed for almost every player in the so-called Edtech space. That's one of the reasons why we see all the chaos that's happening right now.
I think the primary reason why it happens in every sector, there are two kinds of entrepreneurs who are one of our missionary. I can clearly see, right? Your why for Cuemath hasn't changed in the last 9 years, right?
Yeah.
So I would place you in that. There are other kind of entrepreneurs who are mercenary. And I think, unfortunately, those are more suited for venture capital kind of a model because, the VC systems are designed a way that a VC has to return their fund in 8 to 10 years at the max. How mercenaries operate is historically, like how it used to be. For example, Mughals, the earlier version of Mughals, came and looted as much part of India and they could enter as much part and then go back. They would destroy temples, everything, right? And just go back in a very short span of time. A mercenary entrepreneur mindset is I think like that, not destruction, but capture value, whatever is available at the quickest possible manner.
Yeah. Maybe let me just try and rephrase what you said in my own words, right? So I think this land grab approach, which is to say, let's go out and
kill everybody
or acquire as many consumers as possible and so on. It works in certain kinds of products. Like, for example, when you're building a network company, right? For example, cab hailing or cab riding, and you have to win over a certain city. You need certain network effects to kick in. You need a certain supply volume. You need a certain demand volume. And once you cross a certain critical threshold, then that network tends to hold. So there is value in being a mercenary. There is value in being saying, okay, let me just go out and throw marketing dollars at a city.
But we haven't seen great outcomes. Like Uber
We have
below
yeah,
is
that's
IPO
a
price.
that's a different question altogether, by the way, right? Which is yet we haven't seen great outcomes. But I'm saying in education, even that basic premise does not hold, which is to say there's no value in land grabbing. There's no value at all. It's like, you are a mercenary and I tell you, okay, here's $1 billion, go figure out the theory of everything, right? You can't deploy capital to solve that problem. It requires thoughtfulness, it requires research, it requires working in theory and so on. So in the case of learning, it requires you to see certain cycles of the student going through a learning process and seeing what's working, what's not. So there's a certain gestation period it takes for an education product or service to start working and start creating brand value. Like for example, in Vidya Mandir's case, which I referred to, it took them maybe 2 decades to build that brand pool, right? In Comon's case, it took them 50 years to build that brand pool.
50.
50, yeah. They started in a small Tokyo apartment way back in the 70s, and it's only now that they've become a household name. So I think, and as you rightly pointed out, venture capital life cycles are 6 to 7 years in terms of return on the fund and so on. So there might be this case of a fundamental misalignment in terms of cycles, where education businesses operate on longer cycles, and hence, you should not force your way to growth if you are a education company, is what I try and tell every education entrepreneur. There's no value in it. First, build out a foundation, and then you will see hockey stick growth at some point, but that point will be maybe 10 years down the line, right? Not 2 years down the line, not 3 years down the line. It may be massive. It may be so big that you end up building a mega $1 billion business, right? But it won't happen. You can't jumpstart your way to it. I know of no example in education where someone has jumpstarted their way to a huge brand that people trust and like.
Yeah. But that's why I think, right, the model is flawed. Because if everybody entrepreneur, right, and that's how I think the ecosystem is subconsciously training entrepreneurs, is everybody wants to build $1 billion business, then the mind by its habit, right, on how our minds have evolved, wants to short circuit.
Yeah. That's how human nature works, right? Distraction.
So the goal is $1 billion company.
Yeah. So if you are an education entrepreneur and your friend is an e-commerce entrepreneur and they raise a 50 million or 100 million round and you are struggling to raise $1 million round, what will you think, right? You will feel that pressure to say, okay, I need to grow faster. But it's just the nature of education, as it is the nature of healthcare, for example, that you cannot jumpstart, you cannot short circuit this foundation building process. There's no way to do it, and you should not do it. And if you want to do it, you should not get into education. So the first question I ask every entrepreneur who comes to me and says, advise me on building my startup, I tell them, are you in it for 2 decades? Because if you're not, then you shouldn't do it. You need to have a long-term view on this.
I think that's why, right, unknown entrepreneurs who suddenly get all the fame, like Alak Pandey, because those who have been building physics for a long period of time, constantly.
Yeah.
Like nice.
And under the radar for such a long time, right? So
and their goal was never to build, I think, $1 billion company.
So that's what happens in education. Like that example is very inspiring, right? So continued building for such a long time in a very frugal way and so on. And then suddenly that unlock happened because the trust of the student community hit a tipping point.
And then that's what happened to like Bansal classes also.
Yes,
in Kota.
Exactly. Yeah. And at one point it was a household name across the country. Everyone wanted to get into there, right? So I think this is let me call it the fundamental law of education, right? And it's like the fundamental law of education is you need 10 years to build something valuable, something that the ecosystem trusts, students trust, parents trust, and so on. After that, it's great growth. After that, there's no stopping you, as long as the market is large enough and so on, and you do well. But you need that horizon of 7 to 10 years to lay out a very strong foundation and then build on top of it. So education is classic bamboo plants. Give the roots time to grow, and then, then growth will happen.
Can you describe the current scale of Cuemath in whatever way you can, in terms of revenue numbers, in terms of teachers, students?
We have cumulatively taught over 200,000 students over the last few years. As of today, we have about 60 to 70,000 students who are doing classes on a day-to-day basis with us. So that's about 500,000 classes per month on the platform. Quite reasonable scale, and we've been growing year on year. In terms of countries, regions, once we started going outside India, we started seeing a lot of growth from, all over the place. US is our biggest market today. US is also biggest by revenue and also our fastest growing market. Price points there are obviously higher compared to, let's say, some of these other markets. But we are actually teaching kids in 80 plus countries across the world today. And sometimes I look at the student base and I see some student from a small country, and it's quite exciting to see that. And that's the goal ultimately, to teach kids everywhere across the world. And internally, the mission, the way we articulate the mission is 1 billion math minds. How do we create an ecosystem of math learning products and services to touch every kid across the world in some way when it comes to the math learning. In terms of the revenue scale, we'll do something over the next 12 months. We'll cross 50 million in terms of revenue. So we've been growing very nicely. And we have a network of about 8,500 teachers who are all based in India right now, who run these classes for kids from across the world. All math only math. And most of our teachers, by the way, happen to be women, stay-at-home women who are otherwise well-educated, well-qualified and so on, and want to do something meaningful with their time and so on. So we pioneered this gig teacher model in India. We were the first ones to do it. But now a lot of other platforms also do it.
There were also incidences of, entrepreneurs creating artificial demand in education. For example, your son could be next Sundar Pichai.
Okay.
But not to blame them because, right? But I think that demand has passed away.
Yeah. Once again, as I said, education is a high trust category. You need to engineer trust with the parent and the student over a long period of time. Because a lot of education is driven by word of mouth. You may have great reviews or great ads, but ultimately when it comes to making a decision about your child, you'll ask some of your good friends and colleagues on what to do, right? So education is inherently very, very driven by word of mouth. So if you have some short-term fads coming in, or some, let's say this advertising of this kind and so on, it may take hold for a certain amount of time, but ultimately people will see through it. And people will say, okay, this was like all a facade or whatever. And we did see a lot of that last year, right? And that's why so many startups ended up folding up.
You also started computer programming, I think. That was because of peer pressure?
I think maybe 25% of FOMO, in the sense, okay, everyone's doing coding, maybe we should do coding. But 75% was a different thought process in the sense of saying that, see, our approach to coding was not really the coding that other people were doing. We actually were focusing far more on computational thinking. CT is what it is called, right? And computational thinking is a lot more about breaking down a problem into steps, algorithmically thinking, sequencing and skills like that. And that is very, very close to mathematical thinking, computational thinking, right? It's actually a subset of mathematical thinking if you come to think about it. So the thinking for us was, okay, computational thinking is a part of mathematical thinking, so we should do it. And maybe we should position this as a coding program because it seems to be, what the market wants, right? In hindsight, seems to have been we didn't run it for very long. We just experimented with it and so on. But ultimately we decided it's confusing our messaging, and we want to be known for math. Cuemath should stand for math excellence around the world. If we want to do any computational thinking, it should be embedded inside our core program. So that's what we did, by the way. We did not, while we stopped offering the program separately as a coding program, we took a lot of those elements and embedded them into the core math program because that's how we interpret math. We don't think of math just as the subject you do at school. It's a lot more than that. It's a lot more about mathematical thinking, reasoning, logic, computational thinking. So we kind of cleaned it up and said, okay, there's a single math program that we do.
The math is the base of any computer programming.
Yeah, exactly.
Even when you are taught in colleges, people want to make their kids learn early now, but there's no shortcut to it. There's algorithms, there's data structures. It's why, right? Companies like Microsoft, Google, Amazon, they don't take coding interviews. They take data structures. They take algorithm interviews.
Sundar Pichai went to IIT Kharagpur. I don't know if you saw that interview. And someone asked him, Google hires computer engineers or whatever. What do we mathematicians do? Like, we don't have these good jobs or these exciting jobs. And all the cool stuff seems to be going to the computer science guys like ML, AI and so on. So Sundar Pichai said something to the effect of, you are in luck because it's far easier to train a math person to become a AI ML person than it is to, teach a computer science person to learn the math to become a real AI ML engineer or something of that kind is what he said. And I always say this, I think when you look at all the analytical skills, and all the analytical professions today, data science, statistics, AI, ML, product management, for example, and so on, all of it has math thinking at its core. If this is a solar system of skills, then math is the sun. And everyone needs to have that ability of mathematical thinking built deeply into their mind to be able to do this kind of stuff. I think it's going to become more and more important as we see this century progress, just given how technology is evolving.
I really admire how you kept just one focus, maths, for a long period of time, and you kept it mostly offline till COVID hit, and then there was no other option. But you had a great base on which to build an online business. on top of it.
Yeah, exactly. Once again, as I said, the goal was always to build right. So even though a lot of other companies were going online, very quickly, we wanted to go online, or we had thought of going online at some point, even very early in our journey, but we wanted to take the right kind of time to build out the systems and so on. We did not rush into it. So when we started building our online platform in 2018, we were actually going fairly slow and so on. It's actually COVID that forced our hand to instantly transition everything online. And when COVID struck, our online revenue was less than 5% of our entire business. So we did not fall into that FOMO that, we have to, go online just because everyone else is doing it. We wanted to do it right because we knew that if we do it right, then ultimately word of mouth will be great, retention will be great, and, ultimately the business will be sustainable.
So if you have to, or an entrepreneur asks you, right, what's the best way to build a 100,000 student base, paid student base, an educational venture?
Okay. I think the first thing, and this also, I've also been reflecting on this question and what I would have done differently, let's say if I had to start Cuemath all over again. I think the first step I would do, or I would encourage every entrepreneur to do, is to think of creating a gravitational brand pull, even before you start building the service. So let's say you want to teach science in a new way. The right way to do it might not be to start classes right away, but to maybe go on YouTube and to create great science content and to become known among students and parents and educators as someone who likes math, who likes science, and who's like an expert when it comes to science, right? So create a gravitational pull for yourself and for your brand. At some point, maybe a couple of years down the line, when you have a following of some kind, or you have some traction and so on, and you have some feedback also from learners and parents on what they are liking about your content or not liking about your content, you will have a far better sense of what kind of service to build, right? And then you build that service. And you should think of monetization very early on, because if you don't think of monetization, it will not sustain and it will not scale. So yeah, I think go in that order, build a gravitational pull, then launch a service and price it correctly. Obviously, different markets, different segments, you need to look at pricing correctly. If you get pricing wrong, it can be a fatal error. Why? Because, for example, both sides actually. If you price it too high, if you price your service too high, then you price out most of the market. But if you price your service too low, then you start being seen as a suboptimal service. Like it's like in education and healthcare, again, these are not commodity or transactional businesses, right? These are businesses of trust. And funnily, the way a consumer might interpret a higher price is higher quality. So price undercutting is a very, very bad strategy in education, which I see a lot of other edtech players doing for some reason, discounting and so on, right? That's the wrong path to take. So set the right price, hold to it. Make sure you deliver your service at that quality. Make sure consumers are happy and see their value in that price point. And be patient. Take a 7 to 10 year view if you have to get to 100,000 student base, because that's a big number. 100,000 children being trusted by their parents to learn with you is not a mean feat. So these are not small numbers to aim for, right? So yeah.
How would you say, right, the customer acquisition journey has evolved? Because right now, as you said, right, a paid customer acquisition for some educational ventures like 1 lakh rupees, which is not sustainable.
Yeah.
Because the lifetime value of that customer is just 25,000 rupees.
Yeah.
What are your customer acquisition channels? What does your CAC cost look like, if you can share that?
In COVID years, we did a lot of performance marketing, which we are steadily toning down. Because what we've realized about performance marketing is they're good to jumpstart markets. So let's say you need to enter a new country or a new segment. You can get your initial 0 to 1 done with performance marketing and get your initial student base, but then you should steadily have a plan to ramp it down and not rely on it at all. So that's what we are doing. So we are steadily decreasing the mix of performance marketing in our budget of growth. And the reason, for example, you see so many of these unsustainable CACs is people continue to spend on performance marketing and all the edtech players are competing for the same lead. I got this screenshot the other day where someone sent me what a parent sees on their feed, and it had 22 ads of edtech players all saying the same thing, make your child a prodigy or make your child the next whatever. So it's like you're competing for the same lead and you're all spending insane dollars for that, and the only winner in this is Facebook or Google. I read somewhere that 46% or 50% of VC money goes to just these two companies in terms of ad spends, right? So I think for education, given it's a long gestation cycle and so on, you have to be very, very cautious of how much performance marketing you use. So stay away from that. Or I should say start with that maybe, but tone it down. Make sure you're spending a lot of efforts on creating your own gravitational pull. It could be a YouTube channel like what Physics Wala did. It could be a lot of free content you put out on the internet.
What works for you to create that gravitation?
Our website has huge traffic, more than 10 million visitors a month.
Why do people come to the website?
We have been putting out high quality math content on it for years.
For free.
We recently launched our YouTube channel, which we call Cuemath Studio, where we put out very, very exciting real world math content. And that's already starting to see, it's all just crossed. We launched it only a few months ago and it's crossed 10,000 and like 14,000 subscribers now. And that will become one of our main ways to reach potential students and the parents, and also spread the love of math, which is one of our stated mission goals. So create gravitational pull for the brand and rely on a lot on delivering a great service, because that leads to a positive feedback loop, more word of mouth and so on. It's easier to retain an education consumer than it is to acquire a new consumer. So focus heavily on retaining your consumers. If they're not sticking with you, then you don't have a business to build. And if it's a leaky funnel of that kind, then there's no point spending, more money into filling the bucket, because it's just leaking away and it won't hold, and ultimately it'll catch up with you. So these three things, right? Jumpstart using performance marketing, but tone it down. Create your own gravitational pull from day one. And ideally only do that for maybe a year or so, or 2 years before you launch your service or monetized product or whatever. And invest heavily on retention efforts. And make sure that, consumers are sticking with you. Our service quality is great. We make sure that we handpick teachers, the right teachers for the right kids. So, there's no such concept of a best teacher. There's a best teacher for your child, right? So when a student comes in, we baseline and understand the student, and then we assign them the right teacher from our network to work with the student. We have very, very stringent quality checks in terms of how our teachers are doing these classes and what they're doing with the kid in each class and so on. So we do a lot of that. We take constant feedback from the parent and so on. Our retention rates are some of the best in the industry. Well, I can't share too many specifics on this, but yeah, I think they're clearly outlier retention rates that we see on our product lines. And while we have also not fully solved the CAC problem, although our CACs are nowhere close to these numbers, we still need to do a lot of work there. On the other hand, our LTVs are very high. So our lifetime value, the economics on long-term retention are very positive. So
what would we all say price per month for a student in India and as in US?
So we do 3 formats of classes. 1:1, which is obviously the priciest. 1:2 and 1:4. We don't go above 1:4. So 1:1 classes in the US today cost about $25 an hour, which is $200 a month, which is in Indian rupees about 16,000 rupees a month. In India, the price point for a 1:1 class would be something like 5,000 rupees. For a 1:4 class would be something like 2,000 rupees, just to give a sense of that number. So yeah, it varies between these two ranges, depending on what the group size of the class is.
And you think that it can be more democratized, so that more education, more people can leverage Cuemath platform? As
part of our 1 billion math minds mission, right? 1 billion math minds will not happen only by tapping the top of the pyramid. We want to tap every part of the pyramid. And in fact, interestingly, when I started Cuemath, our first investor was an impact investor, and their mandate is more to focus on the middle and bottom of the pyramid. So that's something that's very close to my heart, which is to say, how do we create impact for the entire pyramid and not just the top of the pyramid, right? And we will, over the next couple of years, come out with more kinds of services and product lines to go deeper into the pyramid. So for example, one of the things we are doing is we are perhaps the only or one of the very few education companies that are doing this of their own accord. We have set up our own internal lab of sorts, and we have a lab in Boston where some of the best education researchers in the world have come together, and they're helping us assess our efficacy of our curriculum and so on. So we will take a lot of that work they do and share it with others in a non-commercial way, even like, for example, with school math teachers or with government systems and so on, in the hope that it percolates down and it has some impact even on the bottom of the pyramid. So yes, to your question, we do have that on our radar in terms of how do we go to the lower and lower segments of the pyramid, and ultimately the only way we can achieve our 1 billion math minds mission is to do that.
Thank you so much, man. Love the conversation that we had.
Thanks. I had a lovely conversation as well. Just love talking about this stuff and would love to carry this on at some other point.
Absolutely.
Thank you.